This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today, though, we're going to look at the other end of the spectrum, and I'm going to give you my picks for the worst red creatures in Magic. Red is well known for having good creatures, especially at lower mana values. However, there are 2,141 creatures with a red identity in Magic, so there's bound to be some bad ones, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. Which cards appear on this list and the order in which they appear is ultimately left up to me, of course. However, for a card to appear on one of my worst lists, there are some important criteria. First, the card has to be bad in all of Magic's formats. This includes 40 card limited, 60 card constructed, and 99 card commander. On top of that, the card also has to have always been bad, including in its original context. In other words, I'm not only evaluating these cards based on what is powerful today, I'm evaluating them based on the fact that they haven't ever been good. In other words, for a card to truly be considered one of the worst ever, it has to be bad everywhere and for all of Magic's history. Alright, let's take a look at my picks for the 10 worst red creatures in Magic. At number 10, it's Loafing Giant. This 5-mana 4/6 comes with a massive downside. When it attacks or blocks, you put the top card of your library into your graveyard, and if it's a land, you prevent all combat damage that the giant would deal that turn. In other words, about a third of the time, Loafing Giant's 4 power doesn't matter, and you're paying 5 mana for a 0/6. Now, I should note that milling the top card of your library isn't all downside, as if you're trying to do stuff with your graveyard, it can generate a bit of value for you. However, it doesn't exactly do it quickly. Additionally, the giant has what were pretty good stats at the time, so it isn't quite as bad as it might look to our eyes today. At number 9, it is Goblin Sappers. For one generic and a red, the Sappers are a 1/1 with 2 bad activated abilities. You can pay 2 red and tap it to make a creature you control unblockable for a turn, but then you have to destroy the Sappers and the creature you made unblockable at the end of combat. You can also pay 4 red for the same unblockable effect, but when you go with that option, only the creature you make unblockable gets destroyed. So that first ability means you 2-for-1 yourself for 1 unblocked hit. If you're looking to make creatures hard to block, there are hundreds of better ways to do it that don't make you bet the farm on it. The second ability does keep you from completely blowing yourself out, but you still end up giving up a card for a single unblocked hit. Sure, you could sort of look at this as a very roundabout sacrifice outlet, but once again, there are hundreds of better ways to sacrifice creatures, and many of them don't cost mana. The Sappers also doesn't technically sacrifice itself or the creature, both are just destroyed, so while you can get some triggers for creatures dying, you don't get triggers that check for when a creature or permanent is sacrificed specifically, further limiting the number of places you would actually ever want to play this card. At number 8, I've got Aki Underminer. For 3 generic and a red, the Underminer is a 1/1 that forces your opponent to sacrifice a permanent when it does combat damage to them. Obviously enough, we're starting with one of the absolute worst stat lines in the game. A 4-mana 1/1 is really miserable because it dies to pretty much everything, including really cheap spells and activated abilities. This means you really have to get something great to make up for the massive tempo hit you're risking by playing the card, and Aki Underminer definitely doesn't get there. While making opponents lose permanence is cool and all, there are a few serious problems with this card. The most obvious one is the fact that this 4-mana 1/1 is going to need some pretty serious help to ever get in for combat damage in the first place. You could combine it with Goblin Sappers for some serious value, and I highly recommend using that combo if you want to lose a game really quickly. Anyway, the less obvious problem is that your opponent gets to choose what permanent to sacrifice. By the stage of the game where your Underminer is actually hitting your opponent, it's very likely they will have plenty of expendable permanents to give up. In other words, after taking the risk of playing an inefficient creature and doing the extra work to help the Underminer get in for combat damage, the effect still isn't impressive unless you can find a way to make sure it keeps getting in every single turn, and that's a difficult task. The Underminer does see the most play by far of any card on this list, but I think people have really been seduced by the card's text box without realizing its massive downsides. At number 7, it is Quorum Trench Gnomes. For 3 generic and a red, the Gnomes are a 1/1. You can also tap it to make it so it plains taps for only colorless mana for the rest of the game. As we saw with Aki Underminer, this stat line is miserable, and like the Underminer, you don't get paid off with a good enough ability to make up for it. While the effect is pretty interesting, as there aren't many cards out there that can permanently debuff lands, the fact that the effect is restricted only to planes is a big problem. Sure, you could side this in against someone who has a lot of planes, but guess what? If they are playing a lot of planes, the gnomes are going to be way too slow to actually hinder their mana development. Furthermore, if the opponent is just using lands like Pain lands or other dual lands that don't have the planes type, they're still going to have access to white mana. At number 6, it is Monstrous Hound. This 4/4 costs 3 generic and a red, but the entire text box is downside. Really, really bad downside. It can't attack unless you control more lands than the defending player, and it can't block unless you control more lands than the attacking player. So, in other words, if your opponent went first, there's a good chance this will never have an opportunity to attack or block. Furthermore, red is not exactly a color that's well known for getting lots of lands in play, so the chances of you having more lands than your opponent by turn 4, even if you went first, isn't exactly a guarantee. It's a real bummer they didn't design this so it also works when you and your opponent have the same number of lands, because it means there are a really broad number of situations where Monstrous Hound may as well have come into play with pacifism attached to it. At number 5, it is Carnation Giant. This is another very poorly statted creature. For 6 generic and a red, you get a 3/3. If I'm paying 7 mana, I better be getting a creature that can really shift the game in my favor, and a 7 mana 3/3 definitely doesn't do that. The good news is you can improve the Giant's stats, but the cost of doing it is pretty massive. You can tap an untapped Snowland to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. So sure, if you're playing a deck with all Snowlands, and you probably should be, that does mean this can threaten to attack as a 9/9 on the next turn, but the cost of doing that is that you don't get to add to the board at all, and this doesn't come with any built-in effect that makes it difficult to block. It can be chumped all day long, and it's not difficult to remove. So you end up taking a massive tempo hit when you do what this card wants you to do, and that's a pretty good way to lose the game. At number 4, it is Perk Salamander. For 1 generic and a red, you get a 1/1 with fire breathing. That doesn't sound bad, right? Well, this is fire breathing with a massive downside. The salamander gets sacrificed at the end of your turn when you activate that ability. There are some other fire breathing with downside creatures out there, but most of them at least let you use the ability once or twice without losing your creature. Not so here. And because it has such poor stats, you're going to need to buff it pretty quickly for it to do anything relevant, which also means you're going to be taking a big tempo hit and going down a card every time you play the salamander. At number 3, it is Whiptail Molok. When this card was printed in Dissension, a 5 mana 6/3 was not a stat line you were interested in, and then the Molok has a massive downside. It does 3 damage to target creature you control when it enters the battlefield. That means if it's on its own, it kills itself. If it isn't on its own, it probably kills something else. If you really want to maximize the value of this ability, you're going to need creatures that like it when they get damaged or destroyed, but that's a ton of work to do for a card that has an absolutely miserable fail case. At number 2, it is Flailing Soldier. As a 1 mana 2/2, this is an above rate creature, even by today's standards, but it has an awful text box. Any player can pay 1 generic mana to give it +1/+1, or -1/-1 until end of turn. This means anytime you play Flailing Soldier, you effectively hand your opponent a removal spell that they don't have to use a card for. If your opponent goes first and you play a Flailing Soldier, they can simply kill it by tapping 2 mana. Sure, that does give you a bit of a tempo advantage, because you pay 1 mana for the soldier and they pay 2 to kill it, but that just isn't enough to make up for the card advantage you give your opponent. It does get better if you go first or if you play it later in the game, but you still find yourself in a spot where you have to leave mana up just to save the soldier. It's easy to imagine attacking and buffing the soldier to an absolutely massive size, and it does do that sometimes, but the fact you always have to have mana up or your opponent can just kill your creature without spending a card is just too much of a problem. And at number 1, it's MOG Squad. Like Flailing Soldier, this is a nicely statted creature where the downside is you basically hand your opponent a removal spell. In this case, because it gets -1/-1 for each other creature in play. This means you have to hope your opponent isn't playing other creatures, which is just something that most decks are going to do. Your opponent basically gets to kill the squad for free eventually simply by having 3 creatures in play, and that's a problem. And I haven't even mentioned that it counts your own creatures too, which means you basically can't play more creatures either. It will very rarely ever be a 2 mana 3/3. This card is awful, and will often amount to paying 2 mana just to stick it in your graveyard. Those are my picks for the 10 worst red creatures in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can find ways to do that in the description. Thanks for watching.